Yeats's Epitaph. During the last 10 years, Yeats has had more bouquets from the critics than any other poet of our time. It was refreshing to see these critics, and also many of the younger poets, committing themselves to enthusiasm for an older contemporary. Their praise, however, was sometimes uncritical, and sometimes, on a long-term view, injurious to its subject. There were reviewers who felt Yeats was a safe bet, safe because he was an exotic. Anyone can praise a bird of paradise, but you have to have some knowledge before you go buying Rhode Island Reds. There is a double point that needs making. First, that Yeats was not so exotic as is popularly assumed. Second, that on the whole his exoticism was not an asset but a liability. He was partly aware of this himself. In his middle period he fought clear of the dead hand of Walter Pater and deliberately set out to make his poetry less poetic. And in his later years, the years when he was a devotee of Balzac, he paid at least lip homage to the principle of homo sum. His failure fully to practice this principle was due to a constitutional inhumanity. I say this in honor to his memory. If you believe a man was a genius, it is an insult to him to ignore his deficiencies and peculiarities. One of the most peculiar poets in our history, Yeats was also extraordinarily lacking in certain qualities which the greater poets usually possess. Insofar as he achieved greatness, it proves not the power of inspiration or any other such woolly miracle. All that it proves is the miracle of artistic integrity. For this was a quality he possessed, even though as a man he may sometimes have been a fraud. His more naive enemies regard him as knave or fool all through, at best as a silly old thing. His more naive admirers regard him as God-intoxicated, and therefore impeccable. It is high time for us to abandon this sloppy method of assessment. If poetry is important, it deserves more from us than irresponsible jibes on the one hand, or zany gush on the other. Take Yeats's two passions, Ireland and art. We have to remember that, in regard to both, his attitude was conditioned by a comparatively narrow set of circumstances, and that, in judging his services to Ireland and art, we shall be very short-sighted if we reapply his own heavily blinkered concepts of either. It is a lucky thing for the artist that his work usually outruns his ideology. Yeats talks a good deal about magic and beauty and mysticism, but his readers have no right to gabble these words like parrots and call what they are doing appreciation. Beauty is not the mainspring of poetry, and although a few poets have been genuine mystics, Yeats, unlike his friend A.E., was certainly not one of them. He had what might be called a mystical sense of value, but that is a different thing, and a thing which perhaps, for all artists, is a sine qua non. Yeats's poetry reached its peak in The Winding Stair, 1933. The last poems, now published, represent the Indian summer of his virile, gossipy, contumacious, arrogant, magnificently eccentric old age. Although the book as a whole certainly lacks the depth and range of The Tower or The Winding Stair, although the septuagenarian virility is sometimes too exhibitionist, although he overdoes certain old tricks and falls into needless obscurities, and although the two plays here included are flat failures, there is still enough vitality and elegance to compensate for certain disappointments. Few poets in English literature have been able to write lyrics after 35. The astonishing thing about Yeats is that he remained essentially a lyric poet till the last. Even the enormous cranky pseudo-philosophy of a vision only served as an occasion for further lyrics. Yeats's ingredients became odder and odder, but because they were at least dry and hard, they helped him to assert a joy of life which was comparatively lacking in his early Celtic or pre-Raphaelite twilights. The great discovery of the later Yeats was that joy need not imply softness, and that boredom is something more than one gets in dreams. Axel has been refuted. Hamlet and Lear are gay. Ireland is very prominent in these last poems. Yeats had for a long time regarded the essential Ireland as incarnate in the country gentry and the peasantry, his ideal society being static and indeed based upon caste. The Irish troubles, however, evoked in him an admiration, even an envy, for the dynamic revolutionary. His thought, in assimilating this element, became to some extent dialectical. He began to conceive of life as a developing whole, a whole which depends upon the conflict of the parts. He even began to write in praise of war, a false inference from a premise which is essentially valid. When all words are said, and a man is fighting mad, something drops from eyes long blind. He completes his partial mind. Under Ben Bulben. Physical violence being a simple thing, the Yeats who honoured it took to writing in ballad forms, while the contemplative Yeats continued to use a grand rhetorical manner and a complex inlay of esoteric ideas and images. There are good examples of both in this book. There are also, as in the preceding volumes, a number of poems about himself and his friends. Once again, he goes around with a highly coloured spotlight. It is amusing to turn from one of these poems, Beautiful Lofty Things, which contains a reference to a public banquet in Dublin, to George Moore's account of the same banquet in Ave. The most revealing poem in this book is The Circus Animal's Desertion, where Yeats, with admirable ruthlessness, looks back on his various elaborate efforts to project himself onto the world, Celtic legend, Maud Gonne, symbolic drama. In this excellent and moving poem, a self-centered old man rises above his personality by pinning it down for what it is.